My name is Jared Ortiz, and I teach Catholic theology in the religion department. I'm the director of the Saint Benedict Institute. Thank you all for coming out tonight and braving the coronavirus in this social event. No, but thank you seriously for coming out tonight for the Transgender Question, Theological and Legal Considerations. And we're honored to have two wonderful speakers with us this evening, Theresa Farnan and John Bursch. I'd like to thank all of our co-sponsors, the Cultural Affairs Committee, the Religion Department, the Philosophy Department, the Political Science Department, the Center for Ministry Studies, the Pre-Law Society, Campus Ministries, the Dean of Arts and Humanities, and the Dean of Social Sciences. I'd also like to thank Campus Safety for being here tonight. We organized this event for students. We know that many of our students hold different, even opposing views on the question of gender identity. We also know that many of our students are understandably confused about what to think. We are glad that all of these students are represented here tonight. Whatever you believe, or whether you don't know what to believe, we must acknowledge in truth that there are genuinely difficult questions at the root of these debates. What does it mean to be human? Are male and female true human categories or cultural constructs? What is sex and gender? Is human nature something we receive from God or something we determine for ourselves? Is our biology something we can change? What are the legal consequences for granting or not granting rights based on gender identity? We know that Christians have a variety of perspectives on these questions, and I'd hope those perspectives can all be presented. As the Saint Benedict Institute, we seek to be faithful to what the Catholic Church officially teaches. And that is what will be presented tonight. So let me say a little bit about how tonight will work. So as you see, this event is being recorded, and the whole thing will be available on our website within a week or two. Each of our speakers will present for 20 to 25 minutes, and I have a buzzer, so make sure you keep your comments 25 minutes. After both presentations are finished, we will have an extended question and answer period. And there are note cards, which should be going around now from students. There they are. All right. So if you think you want to ask a question or have a question, please take a note card, and there's also pens that should be going around, or your neighbor has a pen, but disinfect it first. So there's note cards going around for you to write down your questions, and then after the presentation, students will collect these questions, and then Dr. Mulder and I will be reading those questions. Why note cards? Well, a few reasons. One, we're all familiar with speeches from the audience masquerading as questions. We'd like to avoid that. Moreover, we want to guard against any insulting speech. We want you to ask hard questions. But I want to be clear, any question that insults transgender persons will not be read. And any question that insults our speakers or anyone else will not be read. We want hard, challenging questions, but questions that are asked in charity and goodwill. We also want to hear questions, first and foremost, from our students. So students, if you have a question, please write student at the top, and you'll get pride of place in our reading. And lastly, and I mean this most seriously, we really do want to read your questions. So write legibly. Let me introduce our first speaker. Dr. Theresa Farnan is an author and moral philosopher who specializes in virtue ethics, moral education, philosophy of the person, sexual difference and identity, and ethical questions facing the family. She's a founding member of the Person and Identity Project, which provides theological and pastoral resources about the Church's teachings on questions of gender. She's taught at St. Paul Seminary in Pittsburgh, Franciscan University, Mount St. Mary's Seminary. She served as consultant to the Catholic Bishops' Committee on Laity, Marriage, Family Life, and Youth, and is a member of the Catholic Women's Forum Advisory Council. She's the author of numerous books and articles. Tonight, Dr. Farnan will offer some theological considerations on the transgender question. Please help me welcome Theresa Farnan.
I'm going to not look at Dr. Ortiz and not listen to his buzzer. Just kidding. No, I'm delighted to be here, and I really do appreciate the opportunity to explain why the Church teaches what it teaches on the whole the question of transgenderism as an intellectual ideology, as well as the pastoral question of how to best minister to persons who identify as transgender. I want to start by just framing the question a little bit. When I came of age in graduate school, and I was, graduated from college in the late 1980s and was in graduate school in the 1990s, everyone was still, I think, working through Alistair MacIntyre's monumental book, After Virtue. And his thesis there was that in our culture, we were experiencing a huge divide between two sides. The legacy of the Enlightenment project was such that it cast aside presuppositions about human nature and the human person, and instead based its ethical analysis of how to live as a person on autonomy and freedom, and in particular freedom that is freedom from the constraints of human nature. In contrast, classical philosophy has always taught that we as human beings have a human nature, and there is such a thing as human flourishing, which means you live your life in accordance with your nature, and that's how you achieve the good and what is good for you. MacIntyre's, I think, seminal insight is that each side is speaking its own language, and neither side understands what the other person is saying. And so tonight, as I outline the Catholic Church's teaching on what the Church refers to as gender ideology, as well as its pastoral response, I'm going to ask you, if you are coming from a different starting point, to please be patient and try to appreciate the presuppositions that inform the Catholic Church's teaching about the person. Because our teaching about the person rests on deeply held, carefully reasoned insights about what it means to be a human being. And so our teaching, I think you will find, is consistent, it is logical, it is reasonable, it is intended to be compassionate. And the extent to which it becomes a compassionate, or the extent to which we understand how compassionate it is, rests on our ability to put it into practice in our pastoral care of individuals. Okay, so my presentation, my short presentation, I promise, is going to have two parts. So first I'm going to talk about gender ideology and why the Church is worried about it in terms of its effect on catechesis. And then I'm going to talk about pastoral care for persons who identify as transgender. In doing it in this way, I do want to be careful, because I should note, for our faith, there is no divide between belief, the things that we hold to be true, and what we put into practice pastorally. What we know to be true about the person should inform our pastoral care of individuals at all times, okay? All right. So let me start with a simple, very succinct, very brief statement of what we as Catholics believe about the person, okay? And bear with me, because this may seem a little repetitive, but I need to put all this out on the table so I can outline and create a contrast with the teachings of gender ideology, as our Holy Fathers call it. We believe that creation is a given. It is something that is given to us as a gift, and it has intrinsic order and meaning. All of creation has intrinsic order and meaning. We as human beings are part of the givenness of creation, and our human nature also is part of this givenness of creation. The dignity of the person is derived from being a child of God. God creates us in such a way that he calls us to share in his own life. And therein, that relationship with God, therein rests our dignity. Okay? We believe that human beings are an intimate unity of body and soul. The soul is the form of the body, and it is that which makes you to be a human being. You are alive, you are a living being, human being, because you are an embodied person, body and soul. And this embodiment, this intimate unity of body and soul is so strong that you as a person cannot be thought of outside of that intimate union. And this contrasts distinctly with modernity's prioritizing of desire as the identity of the person. We hold as Catholics that the identity of the person is an embodied person who is a creature who is created by God, loved by God, willed by God into existence. Part of this creation is that God creates each of us as an embodied male or female from the moment of conception. And you being created as either embodied male or female is part of your own personal vocation. God has a plan for each of us, and that plan begins when you are at that moment of conception. That moment of creation, your personal vocation begins. You are called into existence as either male or female and called to live as either male or female. Now, I should back up a minute and note also that as a human being, as a person, an embodied person, okay, being embodied as male or female shapes who you are and how you develop. Okay? I am who I am because I am an embodied female. I am a woman. I'm capable of bearing children. I have children. But my whole life, who I am, is marked by being embodied in the body that I have been given by God from the moment of creation. We hold that sexual difference is meaningful and is, in fact, the foundation of the family, and that each of us is given a sexual identity. Again, as embodied either male or female. And this identity, your sexual identity, is a gift with its own intrinsic order and meaning that contributes to your personal vocation. Sexual difference is also meaningful because sexual difference is that which provides the foundation for our family. A family, which is the image of the Trinity in our world, consists of mother, father, and children. Okay? We do recognize, though, that we as human beings are marked by original sin. Original sin is the great disruption which caused alienation of human beings from each other, from God, from creation, and even from our own bodies. Okay? Nevertheless, we know that we are redeemed by the incarnation. Jesus Christ is truly human with a human nature. He was incarnate as a man, not just with a random body. And we finally understand that all of these teachings, and in particular the teachings about the dignity of the person, place limits on the political state, which can recognize the dignity of the person, but is not the source of it. And the political state also can recognize the family, but cannot redefine the family and is not the source of parental authority. All right. With that on the table, let me turn to the question at hand tonight. Okay? I'm going to take as my definition or as my understanding of transgenderism or being transgender, a definition from the Human Rights Campaign, from their website, Understanding the Transgender Community. Okay? Transgender or trans is an umbrella term for people whose gender identity is different from the sex assigned to us at birth. Some transgender people identify as male or female, and some identify as genderqueer, non-binary, agender, or somewhere else on or outside of the spectrum of what we understand gender to be. Some of us take hormones and have surgery as part of our transition, and some don't. Some choose to openly identify as transgender, while others simply identify as men or women. Okay, so I'm taking the definition of transgender from the Human Rights Campaign. And if you recall, I mentioned that I was going to address this question in two parts. First, what does this mean for catechesis? And secondly, how do we respond pastorally to someone who identifies as transgender? Okay. The first thing I want to note is that gender theory proposes that your soul has a gender identity that is not necessarily connected with your given body, your biological sex, and you alone can discover your gender identity. I think that's a fair statement, based not only on this reading of the Human Rights Campaign, but on other readings of what it means to be transgender. Well, the idea that the body and the soul somehow don't align is contrary to the unity of body and soul, and therefore goes against the Christian understanding of the soul as the form of the body, where the actions of the body shape and develop the moral person whom you are. As an embodied female, I as a person will be shaped by my experiences in my body from my birth. Okay? But don't take my word for it. In Veritatis Splendor, Pope John Paul II observes, body and soul are inseparable. In the person, in the willing agent, and in the deliberate act, they stand or fall together. Elsewhere in Veritatis Splendor, John Paul II observes, the person, including the body, is completely entrusted to himself. And it is in the unity of body and soul that the person is the subject of his own moral acts. The person, by the light of reason and the support of virtue, discovers in the body the anticipatory signs, the expression, and the promise of the gift of self, in conformity with the wise plan of the Creator. In other words, as Catholics, we believe in this intimate unity of body and soul. A unity of body and soul that cannot be put asunder or denied without undercutting fundamental Catholic beliefs about, not only about the person, but about moral acting. It is, Veritatis Splendor is one of those foundational encyclicals by Pope John Paul II, and it is the encyclical, The Splendor of Truth, that has to do with his analysis of moral action and how to appropriately exercise freedom. So point number one, gender theory undercuts this unity of the body and soul that has formed a foundation for Catholic moral teaching. Point number two, gender theory proposes there are many different gender identities, each personalized, and that the freedom to be authentic demands the opportunity for you to exercising your autonomy to bring your body into alignment with your identity. That proposition there constitutes a rejection of human nature as we understand it in our Catholic faith. We understand, we believe, we know by reason, we believe by revelation that human beings are created male or female, and that you are created as a man or a woman from the moment of your conception. Okay? And not only that, we hold this from Revelation, yes, from Genesis, but we also hold this by reason. Every sex has a cell. The National Institute of Health specifies that every study has to note whether or not the subject of its study is either male or female. Every single cell in your, I said every sex has a cell. Every cell has a sex. Every single cell in your body has a sex. And so this constitutes for us a rejection of human nature. But again, don't take my word on the importance of this. Pope Benedict XVI, actually prior to his papacy, in an address to the German Parliament, pointed out, no, actually he was Pope at this point, in 2011 noted that there is also an ecology of man. Man has a nature that he must respect and that he cannot manipulate at will. Man is not merely self-creating freedom. He does not create himself. He is intellect and will, but he is also nature, and his will is rightly ordered if he respects his nature, listens to it, and accepts himself for who he is, as one who did not create himself. In this way, and in no other, is true freedom fulfilled. And so, A third thing we can draw out is the differing conceptions of human freedom, where we understand our freedom to be exercised, freedom for pursuing the good, and for bringing the good into being, and it is to be exercised in accord with, or as human beings, in accord with the nature that we have been given by God. And that is the way for human flourishing, rather than seeing ourselves as only free if we can shake off the constraints of human nature and declare ourselves to be autonomous even from our bodies. Okay? So that's the second major sticking point. The third one is that gender ideology, with its insistence that sexual difference is no longer rooted in the difference between men and women, but has instead become an individual personal project. In that way, gender ideology undermines the given family. In rejecting sexual difference, gender ideology rejects the given relationships that are the basis of the family in favor of chosen or intentional families. And it's not only rejecting being a mother or father, it's rejecting being a son or a daughter, an aunt or an uncle, a brother or a sister. Gender ideology also redefines the relationship of the person to the state, as John will talk about shortly. Who decides or ratifies the individual decision in cases involving an individual who wants to assert a transgender identity? The state. If you have, for instance, a situation where an individual seeks to change his or her gender identity marker on a birth certificate, who decides? The state. The state makes the final decision. Who decides if a child may transition? The state. The state has given itself the position of being the final arbiter. And parents who don't support transition shortly find themselves replaced by court-appointed guardians, no matter what their reason for not supporting a transition. This undermines the proposition, long held in Catholic social teaching, that parents are the primary educators of their children, and that in most instances, parents are uniquely poised to help their children. And finally, as Pope Benedict and Pope Francis both have stated so eloquently, rejecting yourself as God has made you is to reject the gift of the body that God has given you. It is to reject the givenness of creation. It is to reject the personal vocation, which is your call by God to live in relationships. And so, in doing so, you reject God the Creator. Catechetically, then, you, meaning as an ideology. Again, I'll talk pastorally on the level of personal care, but to assert that human beings can do this is to engage in that intellectual rejection of that. Catechetically, then, I hope it is clear to you that as Catholics, our insistence that we cannot engage in affirmative care for a person who identifies as transgender is not just merely a situation where we say we won't do this. It is truly a situation where, as Catholics, we cannot do this, because to engage in the affirmation of the ideology that underlies transgenderism is to undercut foundational teachings of our Catholic faith. It undermines foundational beliefs about human beings, about moral action, even about the incarnation and the nature of Christ himself. It redefines the person so that the person is fragmented and no longer a unity. It redefines human nature, the family, and both the person and the family's relationship to the state, and finally calls into question the person's relationship to God, the Creator. And so there are teachings of the Church given by popes, given in the Catechism. In June of 2019, the Congregation for Catholic Education issued a document on education and how we understand or how we respond to gender ideology in the Church. All of these are very clear that affirming gender ideology is incompatible with catechesis, with handing on the truths of our faith as revealed by God and known through reason. Now that still leaves us with, I think, what is the most important question for everyone here, which is the question of pastoral care for individuals who identify as transgender. So we address this in the order of catechesis, but on the other hand, here we have individuals who are truly in distress and who are, in many cases, suffering. How do we as a church respond to individuals who are suffering or who are in pain? Okay. Well, I want to start with areas of agreement. Point number one, all of us, I think, agree that we must affirm the absolute dignity of the person. And in fact, I would suggest as Christians, we have a stronger basis for affirming the absolute dignity of the person, because the dignity of the person does not rest on or require social acknowledgement. It rests on their relationship with God himself. And so we are called in everything we do to treat everyone who comes before us with absolute dignity and respect. We should encourage every person to see their primary identity as a child of God, right? And therefore, we are all equal. We are all equal, equal in dignity, equal in value. Okay? Now, I'd like to turn to some practical questions. I think as a church, as part of this recognition of the dignity of the person, we, particularly as Catholics, should be well aware that each person is created as an individual with, again, as I mentioned, a personal vocation. And so what you are called to be, what you are called to do in your life is going to look very unique. And this means that we need to recover and help lead the way a cultural tolerance for atypical interests, where we see atypical interests as a variation rather than as a problem that needs to be fixed, right? So a child, a boy who likes to dress in pink, should be seen as a boy who likes to dress in pink. I have plenty of children who like the color pink, rather than seeing it as a stereotype that's going to box a child into an identity. We especially need to support healing for comorbid conditions. Many of these children who present, children and young adults who identify as transgender, are truly suffering, and they're suffering from many other accompanying conditions. There's a high rate of trauma that children and young adults who identify as transgender have experienced in their lives. Okay? They need our support, they need our healing. There can be a high rate of depression. There can be accompanying autism. 1/3 of the patients who presented to the Tavistock Gender Clinic in the UK are on the autistic spectrum, right? Those are individuals who need support. They need support and they need pastoral care for issues that are there and existing and in fact maybe even more problematic for them than some of the, in fact they may be driving the symptoms of gender dysphoria. Now I'd like to address in my, I don't even know how much time I have left, sort of the elephant in the room, which is that we live in a culture where the affirmative care model is being pushed as the only way and the most compassionate way to treat children. And I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about that today. The affirmative care model involves a progression where a child, depending on the age that they identify as transgender, may first initially go through a social transition, then a medical transition, and then finally a surgical transition. And as an individual is going through that, our role as their friends, as their supporters, our culture is telling us, is to support and to affirm them. Now, we as Catholics, for reasons of our faith, cannot affirm the idea that an individual can reject his or her given sexual identity. We cannot. I've gone through the reasons for that. But what I'd like to just put out here for you, for everyone to consider is the affirmative care model of therapy, in fact, the most compassionate model? Our faith would say that we seek to integrate body and soul through a holistic, organic way of trying to heal the trauma and other accompanying mental health issues, social issues, depression, try to help that child integrate his or her sexual identity so that he or she is able to resolve some of these issues and do it in a way that is not harmful or destructive to their bodies. But when a child or a young adult goes through these gender transitions, our culture is currently putting forward the proposition that many of these therapies are harmless or are sort of a pause button or are reversible. And today I would like to insist that that is in fact not the case. The Endocrine Society, when it put forward its paper, position paper, arguing, and I will note in saying this, I'm going against the American Academy of Pediatricians, the American Psychological Association, and the American Association of Endocrinologists. But in their paper outlining their arguments for the affirmative care model, the National Endocrine Society acknowledges that there is weak or low quality evidence in support of the therapies that they are recommending. An American Academy of Pediatricians journal paper just this week, I was just reading it on my way out here, pushed back on the idea that puberty blockers are efficacious in bringing down the risk of suicide, which is, I think, for everyone, the big concern. We don't want children committing, or young adults committing suicide. Therapies that are said to be reversible carry with them significant medical harm. Puberty blockers, again, which are said to be reversible, cause osteoporosis in young people and have significant effects on brain maturation and development, while the combination of puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones leads to sterilization of that young person. They block natal puberty, the puberty of your biological sex, while inducing the secondary characteristics of puberty of the opposite sex, and thus a child never truly goes through puberty. Cross-sex hormones also lead to metabolic problems, deep vein thrombosis, and can significantly worsen dysphoria. One of the leading surgeons of pushing the affirmative care model, Johanna Olson Kennedy, out in California, has a graphic where she talks about the age at which she will do a double mastectomy. And in some cases, she's done it as young as the age of 13. And her argument for that is, well, they went on testosterone, but boy, the gender dysphoria went off the charts, so they really needed to have that double mastectomy. Well, wouldn't you think that maybe we should think about the effect of going on a testosterone as a 13-year-old? That where it is completely at odds with your biological makeup. Even social transitioning is not harmless. While the normal course of gender dysphoria is such that gender dysphoria resolves at the onset of puberty in 80% of cases, once social transition is initiated, 97 to 100% of children go on to medical or even surgical transition. In other words, by introducing social transitioning, we're pushing children down a gender transitioning funnel where it becomes increasingly hard for them to walk it back. It's hard for us to see this in our society today, perhaps, and I'm a free market person, but because our model of healthcare is a capitalist model. But in some countries with socialized medicine, we're beginning to see pushback against the affirmative care model. In the UK right now, there is a burgeoning medical scandal at the Tavistock Clinic where 33 practitioners resigned this summer because they were so concerned about children being rushed down the gender transition pathway. Australia, too, has opened up an investigation of its major gender clinic and is investigating the harms that are being done to children. And some, in fact, have begun to question the whole idea of gender transitioning as the ultimate conversion therapy, where a young man or woman with atypical interests is rushed into and is encouraged to transition. Surgeries, too, have a significant rate of complication and secondary infections. One doctor I know described it as unacceptably high, one third of surgeries, and in complication or secondary infections. We also know that there are significant conscience conflicts with religious liberty, and John Bursch will discuss that too in a moment. And so I'd like to end by asking you whether you agree with us or not. My purpose here tonight is not to convert anyone. It's not to win you over to my side, but to let you know that as Catholics, when we push back and protest against or reject the affirmative care model for children or young adults who are seeking to transition, we have deeply considered reasons that stem not only from our Catholic convictions and from our faith, but from our concern to engage in pastoral care. And maybe we're not offering the quick fix. We're not offering the quick fix to young people. But what I'd like to think is that as a church, we can offer a way of compassion and love and support for people who are in significant distress and help them on a longer journey towards holistic healing of the person. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Farnan. And again, please, if you have questions, please write them down and hold them, and we'll collect them after our next speaker, who is John Bursch, who is the Vice President of Appellate Advocacy for Alliance Defending Freedom. He also owns Bursch Law, a Michigan appellate boutique. Over the past dozen years, John has argued 12 cases in the Supreme Court and 30 cases in the Michigan Supreme Court. These cases include many of the most important legal issues of our time. Mr. Bursch is one of the most successful lawyers in the country, and we are honored he could speak with us tonight. Tonight, Mr. Bursch will offer some legal considerations on the transgender question. Please help me welcome John Bursch.
Thank you. Well, Dr. Farnan talked about the tension between gender ideology and theology. My role is to talk about some of the tension between the ideology and the legal issues that arise. And it's particularly important for everybody in the room to be considering these tensions right now, because there's a petition drive that has been started that would put on the ballot this November a proposal to amend the civil rights statute in Michigan. It's called the Elliott-Larsen Civil Rights Act, to add sexual orientation and gender identity. And when you change the law in that way, there are other interests that are impacted, and we need to be thinking about those. Before I get into that, I want to just briefly make a comment about my primary employer, Alliance Defending Freedom. It is the largest public interest law firm in the world that defends religious liberty and free speech, the rights of everybody in this room. I know that there are those who have gone out on the internet and seen that a group called Southern Poverty Law Center calls ADF a hate group, and nothing could be farther from the truth. I work with people who are compassionate and loving, and whose primary goal, the whole reason for the organization's existence, is to keep the door open for the spread of the gospel. Because ADF, even though it's an ecumenical Christian organization, has the same goals and purposes as the Catholic Church, to make sure that everybody gets to heaven. And the reason for that is because we are all called, as Dr. Farnan explained, as sons and daughters of God, our identities not being found in any of the other interests or attractions or the feelings that we have, but in our identity as sons and daughters of God, to be holy and to take as many people to heaven with us as possible. And so I hope that you can understand right off the bat that there is nothing hateful about that. There are disagreements that ADF has with culture on issues that are fundamental, like gender identity or like marriage. Contrary to what the culture believes, ADF, like the church, teaches that the greatest goods in life do not come from sexual expression or activity, but from self-giving love, sacrificial love. And you can ask any priest that you've ever met who's taken a vow of celibacy that there is a much greater good in self-giving love than there is in sexual expression. So those who have a different view than our organization or the church, based on identity, anthropology, purpose, whatever, that want to change the law to include gender identity as a component of sex, often don't talk about the significant tensions, the legal ramifications. And so in the limited time that I have before questions, I'm going to quickly run through a dozen of those. Number one, which is foremost in many people's minds today, are athletics. When a boy identifies as a girl and they have a right to compete against women in athletics, it does not create a level playing field. There are 3 women in Connecticut who just filed a lawsuit under Title IX, which is a federal law that recognizes that women are entitled to equal rights and fair play in sports. The reason that they're filing this lawsuit is because 2 boys in Connecticut over the last 2 years have won 15 state girls track and field titles and broken all kinds of records as biological males competing as women. When the women and their parents complained to Connecticut Title IX officers about this, they were told that girls have the right to participate, but they don't have the right to win. Now, people can have different views about that kind of participation, but it's foolish to just look at the issue and think that there is no impact on anybody else when we redefine sex to include gender identity in athletics. Another instance is in women's shelters, and this is not a hypothetical problem, but a real one. In Alaska, there's a women's shelter that will serve everybody during the day. They provide food and clothing and other resources that people need. But at night, it's an abused women's shelter, and so only women are allowed to sleep there. There was a biological male who presented at the clinic in a pink nightgown who was intoxicated and had some terrible physical damage that had been done to the body. And so the center took this man to the hospital, transported, paid for them, and has continued to work with this individual on an ongoing basis to try to resolve some of the personal issues that he's going through. The Anchorage City Council, which has an ordinance that prohibits discrimination in public accommodations based on gender identity, insisted that the shelter, when this man presented as a woman, had to allow the biological man to sleep in the same room, mere feet away from women who had been raped, trafficked, and abused. And you can imagine the kind of emotional trauma that would afflict on those women. And a federal court had to intervene and ultimately issued an injunction to stop the city council from forcing that on the women's shelter. It's called Downtown Hope. Again, people can have different understandings of gender identity, but it affects other people when you adopt different understandings. Third, we have privacy places, and this is particularly acute in schools, but this could happen anywhere. And now I'm talking about showers, restrooms, locker rooms, and the like. The Boyertown School District in Pennsylvania secretly adopted a policy that allowed anyone who identified as a different gender than their own to use the privacy spaces that aligned with their identity as opposed to their biological sex. There was a young man who was in the locker room, and he was in a state of undress down to his underwear. He looked next to him, and he saw a biological girl who was also in her underwear. He was extremely distressed by that. He ran out, and he refused to change in that locker room anymore. In fact, he stopped going to gym class and eventually dropped out of school altogether because of the trauma that he experienced. There was also a young woman who was a product of the foster care and adoptive system, who was confronted by a boy in the girls' restroom. And when these students and their parents went to administrators, the administrators said, well, we implemented this policy but didn't tell anybody about it, but you've got to just get used to it and treat it like this is normal. Well, those students and their parents didn't think that it was okay to have someone of the opposite biological sex in the shower with their son or daughter, and so they filed a lawsuit. And that case went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. The school prevailed in the Court of Appeals, and the U.S. Supreme Court ultimately decided not to review the case. And so we continue to see across the country proliferations of policies that allow this kind of intermixing of the sexes. And keeping in mind, as Dr. Farnan explained from the Human Rights Commission definition, the whole notion of being transgender isn't necessarily binary. It doesn't just mean a boy who identifies a girl and therefore presents and dresses as a girl. It includes a whole spectrum of things, including boys who identify as girls but continue to present and act like boys. And so under these policies, it would give the right to a biological boy who's got a beard and male muscles and wears male clothing and everything else to walk into the girls' shower without any consequences for that. So again, there's a tension in rights. Fourth, we have employers, and this involved my 12th U.S. Supreme Court case, Harris Funeral Homes, which I argued last October. Harris Funeral Homes is a family-owned business that has served the grieving family members of the deceased in the Detroit area for more than 100 years. And they have rules of conduct, including a sex-specific dress code that's intended to allow their clients to focus on processing their grief as opposed to the funeral home and any of its employees. They hired a biological male to be a funeral director, and the funeral director agreed to abide by that policy and strictly followed it for 6 years. But at the end of that 6 years, presented a letter to the owner, Tom Rost, that said the employee was actually a woman trapped in a man's body and intended to dress and present as a woman at work while meeting with the funeral home's grieving clients. Now, this immediately caused a bunch of emotions to rise up in Mr. Rost. First and foremost, he was concerned about the employee, Stevens. Obviously, he was going through a lot. And Stevens also had a wife, and Tom thought about all the implications that these issues must be having on their relationship. He also thought about the female employees who worked in the funeral home, including an 80-year-old woman who worked at the site where Stevens was located, and they would be all sharing the private restroom facilities. Tom also thought about his grieving clients and what impact that might have on them. And at the end of the day, he concluded that he was not able to go along with this proposal, and as a result, they parted ways. Well, the EEOC has long had a policy that allows employers to have sex-specific dress policies, just as they are allowed to have sex-specific showers, overnight accommodations, restrooms, and locker rooms. But in this instance, the EEOC saw an opportunity to change the law. And so they sued the funeral home, and they made the argument that what had happened was sex discrimination under Title VII, which is the federal law that prohibits discrimination in employment. Now, for decades, the U.S. Supreme Court has interpreted Title VII consistent with its original public meaning, the way all of us would have understood it when it was enacted in 1964, as prohibiting women being treated worse than men because they are women, or vice versa. It's very simple, treating one sex more favorably than the other because of sex. And in this case, it isn't sex discrimination to not allow someone who wants to dress as a member of the opposite sex, because any male who wanted to dress as the opposite sex was prohibited from doing so. Any female who wanted to dress as the opposite sex was prohibited from doing so. So men and women were treated equally. But the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit disagreed with that and said that the funeral home was liable for its change in the meaning of the definition of sex. And we should know sometime between now and the end of June what the Supreme Court is going to say about that. But again, there's a tension there for employers. It also extends to employees. Because of Title VII and the prohibition on sex discrimination in employment, that includes a prohibition on sexual harassment or sexually hostile work environments. Well, if you change the law so that sex includes gender identity, that would also include hostile work environments based on gender identity. And that could be something as simple as Dr. Farnan being in her place of work and expressing her opinion based on her religion and her philosophy and her anthropology and everything that she's learned, that God created men and women in his image, distinctly male and female. Well, an employer could look at that statement and say, well, that's creating a hostile environment for other employees who are transgender or have transgender sympathies. And that person could be fired simply for holding that belief. Again, there's a tension. There's also a separate tension, this is category number 6, involving free speech as it applies to employees. And I'm going to talk to you about a professor at Shawnee State University. His name is Nicholas Merriweather. Ironically enough, he's a professor of philosophy. And he was approached by a biological male student who wanted to be referred to with female pronouns. Now, Professor Merriweather had always referred to his students in a formal way, as sir or madame or Mr. or Ms., because he thought that was respectful, but also because he believed that men and women were different and created for a purpose. So when the student came and demanded that he be using feminine pronouns when referring to the student, that was something that Professor Merriweather couldn't do. And the student immediately got in the professor's face and became aggressive, circling him and says, I guess that means I can call you a word that I can't even pronounce or say out loud. And so this became a faculty dispute. And in the process of trying to resolve the conflict, Professor Merriweather agreed that he would call any student who preferred it by their first or their last name. And they could pick their first or their last name. But that wasn't enough for the administration unless Professor Merriweather gave in and agreed to call the student by pronouns that he thought were not true. He was not allowed to stay at the school, and he was ultimately fired. And he has filed a lawsuit over that that is still pending. Seventh area is in the area of religious liberty. This comes up, for example, in medical care. There's a Catholic hospital in California called Dignity Health, and they declined a hysterectomy to a woman who desired to transition to being a male because she had a male gender identity. Now, the Catholic Church's teaching on artificial contraception, including hysterectomies, goes back years before culture became aware of the gender ideology movement. It's based on the ethical and religious directives that the Catholic Church in the United States has issued, and it prohibits any artificial contraception being imposed on anyone without some other non-contraceptive reason. But yet on the basis of that denial, a California Court of Appeals said that the patient had stated a claim for discrimination based on sex. And the California Supreme Court refused to hear that case. The U.S. Supreme Court is now being asked to take that case. But if it goes forward and the patient is successful, that essentially tells Catholic hospitals or any religious hospitals that they cannot deny a sex change operation because of their religious beliefs. This also comes up frequently in the school context, and we see this with Catholic and other Christian schools that have policies of faith that require everyone to affirm that they will live by the teachings of the church. And this often includes oaths with respect to marriage and with respect to sex or gender. And schools have been accused of discriminating for refusing to give in to someone who comes in either as an employee or as a student that wants to challenge those beliefs and demand that the school not live according to its religious principles. And down in Florida recently, there were even 2 national banks, one that changed its mind, that refused to give money to a scholarship program that benefited needy students in Florida that went to private schools of all nature. But it was because that there were Christian schools that had these affirmations of faith that they would no longer donate to that program. Eighth, the tension affects the scientific method. There's another professor, his name is Alan Josephson, and he was the director of child psychiatry at the University of Louisville, and he had rebuilt the program into really a national powerhouse. Well, he was an expert on these kinds of things, and he became concerned at some of the information that Dr. Farnan was talking about, specifically how quickly doctors were rushing to not only affirm children who exhibited some signs of gender dysphoria, but to give them hormone blockers and hormones and surgery at very young ages in ways that he thought could be damaging. And in a public talk that was recorded at the Heritage Foundation, he gave some remarks. And he didn't disparage the affirmation method of treatment. All he said was, we need to go slow on this because the medical evidence that we have of this treatment's effectiveness has not caught up to how quickly this is taking over the country. And based simply on that, he was demoted from his position and then effectively harassed and fired because he encouraged slow, deliberate, scientific-based changes to medicine as opposed to politically driven ones. And his litigation is also pending. Number 9, we have those individuals who are actually experiencing gender dysphoria themselves. This clinic that Dr. Farnan mentioned in England, there's now a lawsuit pending by someone who initially transitioned through the clinic and now detransitioned because having that transition did not help their mental health. And the allegation against the clinic is that it did not adequately disclose at the time it was engaging in all this intervention that was a possible outcome. In fact, the best scientific survey that we have of transition, and now I'm talking about a full sex change operation, comes from a long-term study in Sweden, which found that suicide rates for those who are suffering from gender dysphoria, which admittedly are very high and something that we should be extremely concerned about and compassionate about for all the reasons Dr. Farnan mentioned, that suicide rate actually increased for those who went through a full sex change operation. And we see now increasingly large numbers of detransitioners, people whose stories are not being told by the media, but I think this will ultimately be resolved in more litigation against these clinics, who, again, are saying, you didn't tell me that this wouldn't solve my problems. You didn't tell me that at the end of this road, I may be worse off than I was. And now if I was a woman and I'm a man, I can't put my body back together anymore. I'm permanently disfigured. I'm permanently sterile. I will never have children. And so speaking of children, that brings us to legal tension number 10. As Dr. Farnan mentioned, those children who are just left to their own devices when they experience gender dysphoria as young students, adolescents, even teenagers, will eventually realign their mind with their body, which after all is the predominant way that we treat all kinds of mental health where there is that misalignment. If you have a student who's anorexic, they don't see their body for what it is, but they think that it's too fat. The treatment is never to align the body with what's in the mind, it's to try to align the mind with the body. The same for those who have the mental illnesses where they think that a limb on their body doesn't belong there, and they would do anything almost, to cut off their arm because it just doesn't feel right. You would never allow them to actually take off their arm if you could possibly prevent it. You would try to align their mind with the body. But yet with children, we're not doing that. In contrast, the 97 to 100% of the students who are affirmed will end up having gender dysphoria their entire life. They're being funneled into a track where they're going to be permanently harmed. And whether that's just feelings of dysphoria or it's the stress and anxiety caused by having gone through a surgery and then detransitioning at the end of it, these are real concerns that need to be taken seriously. The 11th category is the parents of these children, because increasingly in states that are pushing the pro-affirmation agenda, parents are being cut out of the process. In California now there's been a couple parents who, because they would not immediately affirm a child who expressed some sense of having a gender identity that differed from their sex, they categorized them as being engaged in child abuse and neglect, and they sought to terminate their parental rights. This has happened in other jurisdictions too, including Pennsylvania and Texas. And again, with parents, it's a very difficult situation because when you go out on the internet, you're going to see all this information from the American psychologists and the psychiatrists and the pediatrics folks, saying, yes, affirm, affirm, affirm. And yet there are all these countervailing considerations that suggest maybe that's not the best path for your child and not in their best interests. And yet because of the legal tension, those parents are being forced into a single track where they aren't allowed to choose how to parent their children. Last is the tension with society as a whole. And this isn't really so much as a legal tension, but a moral and ethical tension. And it brings us full circle back to some of the things that Dr. Farnan was talking about in catechesis. And this really comes to something that's kind of grown as a movement since the sexual revolution against any Christian denomination that holds beliefs about marriage and human sexuality that look like those in the Catholic Church. And the message is that the church is only there to say no to you. No to premarital sex, no to extramarital sex, no to pornography, no to same-sex relationships, no to identifying with the gender identity that you have. And really, that's not what the church is teaching at all. As Dr. Farnan explained, the church is saying yes to something. It's saying yes to a positive vision that everybody was created in the image and likeness of God, and that the body and the soul are indivisible. We rejected Gnosticism beginning in the 2nd century and over again since then, and that you can't separate these things, and that when you acknowledge those basic principles, those ultimately are what's best for the human person. And so the church's teachings on all these issues are not a series of no's. They're a guidebook to the best possible version of each individual. And the way I like to think about this is like that manual that nobody ever reads that's in the glove compartment of your car. There was someone at some point in the process who designed and created that automobile. And with it, they created an instruction book so that that automobile would work to the best of its ability. Peak operating efficiency at all time. Now, you don't have to follow those rules. You don't have to change the oil. You don't have to change the oil filter. You don't have to change the tires, any of those things. But when you stop following those rules, what happens? The car doesn't operate the way the person who made it intended. It becomes less functional, and eventually it gets to a point where it will stop working altogether. And so the church's call on these things is not to be full of animus towards anyone, not to engage in sharp disagreement, but to talk lovingly and with great care, because everybody does have the dignity of being a son or daughter of Christ, to help folks understand that these rules are not no's, but to make each individual the best possible version of themselves, someone who can pursue that goal of self-sacrifice and love for others that will ultimately bring them fulfillment, not only here on earth, but in heaven. And when you change laws to say that all of that is just a lie and that we should follow our own personal idea, we should reject that book in the glove compartment, we're fundamentally changing the entire moral structure of the way that society thinks about what is good for the person. Now, unfortunately, moral relativism has become a disease in our culture. And for the college students who are here, your generation is getting the brunt of this. 90% of your peers believe that everyone has the right to decide for themselves what truth is. But that type of moral relativism injures and it wounds far more than these teachings do, which have the exact opposite effect. They affirm the dignity and worth of every individual human person. And so we need to be very cautious and think very carefully before signing a petition that will write something like this permanently into Michigan law, or frankly at the federal level either, where some similar efforts are being made. So I think I've at least gotten to my 25 minutes, perhaps exceeded them by a couple. And so I thank you for your patience. And now we are very much looking forward to the next hour of this dialogue.
Thank you. And if you have questions, please pass them this way and pass them that way. And Jack will be standing over there. Students will be collecting questions, and we will be reading those questions.
lots of notes being passed. I'm very encouraged by this.
Great. If you think of other questions as they arise, we'll see what we can get to. I have one here on the top that I'll ask as other questions are coming in. And again, I'm going to screen questions that I deem are deliberately insulting to anybody. But I also want to say that we extend some grace to those who are asking the questions. Everyone here is in a different place in terms of their understanding of this and their learning, right? So if some things are not phrased perhaps in the best way, I just ask that we extend some grace to the questioner. So first question. What about a child born with neither male or female genitalia? The doctor decides whether the child is male or female. This is called intersex. The doctor is sometimes wrong. The child is confused and often doesn't match with the doctor's choice. As a parent, should the state decide or should the parent?
That's it. Do you mind? I'm going to jump in. That is probably the most common objection to the teaching of the church. So let's talk for a minute. Those are what have always been referred to in medicine as disorders of sexual development. And believe it or not, disorders of sexual development are binary. In other words, some disorders are associated with male children, and some disorders are likely to or will only occur in female children. Okay, so when these disorders of sexual development occur, as I understand from, I'm not a doctor, but I usually present actually with physicians, and the process goes something like this. There is an attempt made to discover what the actual biological sex of the child is. Whether you use chromosomal analysis, whether you not only examine what the genitalia are, but also look at some of these other factors, look at the levels of hormones, look at exactly what is going on with the child. And then with any pathology, then a physician's job is to assess whether or to the extent to which the pathology can be corrected. And my understanding from speaking to people or from email exchanges I've had with pediatricians and plastic surgeons, the first job is to restore functioning to the child's genitalia in this sense. So you want to make sure that the child can urinate and eliminate waste appropriately. That's task number one. Let's restore biological functioning to the child. And then the second task is to assess the degree to which you are able to heal that pathology. Now, a friend of mine who is a doctor compared the whole, what she calls a red herring of disorders of sexual development to this example. She said, I'm a critical care specialist, and sometimes I encounter children in the ICU or babies in the NICU who have been born with a heart with one chamber. Now, no physician is going to look at that pathology and say, maybe here we have a spectrum of what hearts should look like. They would instead look at it and say, here is a pathology that could potentially prove to be harmful to this child. In the case of the heart anomaly, can be lethal. And we need to do whatever we can do to correct the pathology. So in the case of a disorder of sexual development, the pediatrician, working with the parents, is going to assess the degree to which the pathology, that disorder of sexual development, can be repaired and help that child to live a normal, healthy life. But let me be clear about something. Those cases have always existed. The Catholic Church has always recognized that people may have different medical conditions. That is not what we're talking about here. The transgender phenomenon involves men and women, boys and girls, children and young adults who have healthy bodies. At stake in this whole transgender issue is not whether or not someone might have a disorder of sexual development, because those are not the children we're talking about or the young adults we're talking about. These are young adults and children who have healthy bodies, and we're engaging or we're allowing either them or their parents to decide to engage in body modification for the purpose of achieving the appearance of the opposite sex.
So here's a question: How does the gender identity conflict affect the relationship between church and state? Does this relationship need to change in order for the church to hold on to its deeply rooted beliefs?
Well, the whole notion of the separation between church and state is itself deeply confused. The Establishment Clause, the way that it was enacted, was only to prevent the federal government from creating its own church and then forcing everyone to practice it, as often happened under despots and kings in England and other places. The notion of a wall between separation in church and state doesn't appear anywhere in the Constitution. It appears in a writing of Thomas Jefferson, taken out of context, that the U.S. Supreme Court inserted into a decision more than 100 years ago, and now has kind of taken on a life of its own. I was discussing with some pre-law students a little earlier tonight that if you think about documents like the Constitution or statutes based on their original public meaning, that is the meaning that anyone who had a reasonably good comprehension of English would have understood them at the time of enactment, which is the way that we interpret laws, no one at the time of the ratification of the Constitution would have understood the Establishment Clause as prohibiting prayer in schools, because there was prayer in almost every school. All the public schools were mostly Protestant at that point. No one would have understood the Establishment Clause as creating a wall that would prohibit city councils or Congress from praying before there was a session that they were about to go into. No one in that time period would have thought that a cross erected as a memorial to war veterans that happened to be on public land somehow violated that principle, or even that if you had a nativity or a Ten Commandments monument in the public square, that somehow that would violate it. So really the problem between church and government on the understanding of gender identity, it's on the understanding of what that separation is supposed to look like. And the government should never be in a position of instructing churches about how they need to live, whether it's in a Catholic hospital or a Catholic adoption center, parenting, or in any other context, how they have to be instructing people to live, because that is exclusively the province of the religion. And when you look at it in that light, there really isn't much of a conflict at all. The conflict is being created by those who want to marginalize and silence the religious voices in our country. And they do that through public disapprobation, by calling them things like hate group to try to shut down discussion so people won't listen to them. And they try to do it by passing laws like this amendment to the Elliott Larson Civil Rights Act, which says as a matter of law in Michigan that if you hold the Catholic view on gender identity, that you're a discriminator, that you're a bigot. And so those are laws that we should reject. And so long as everyone understands that we're in a pluralistic society and that we all have the ability to talk to each other as neighbors and to persuade and to treat each other with love and compassion, there isn't a role there that the government needs to play to force anybody's views on anybody else. And that's a substantial amount of the work that I do, is preventing governments, whether it be federal, state, or local, from imposing their beliefs on religious people or on religious organizations. But there doesn't have to be a conflict.
From a student, what is the difference between a boy who likes to wear pink and social transition? What constitutes acceptable quirks and what crosses the line into social transition?
Oh, that's a fantastic question, actually. I mentioned before that as a church we need to recover a cultural tolerance for atypical interests. And there's an article in Quillette by an endocrinologist named Will Malone, where he has a chart there that talks about interests and how they're distributed among men and women. And it's a bell curve, right? So you have the typical girly, what we would characterize as girly interests, and then sort of the great middle. And then there's a whole group of young women who have interests that would be considered atypical, but that tend to be associated more with boys. You know, so a girl who likes to work on cars would be an example. And then the same thing for boys. So you can have boys who are into the hardcore boy, things we would associate stereotypically with boys, the great middle, and then boys who have interests that we would associate more with girls. And the point of the chart is that no matter what your interests are, you're still in the range of behaviors that men and women associate with. So how do we understand the whole thing of a child wearing pink as opposed to, is it an atypical interest? Should we socially transition? Well, the distinction I would draw is this, right? Social transitioning involves the statement to other people that you have changed genders, okay? And what usually happens is that a child will express atypical interests. One example that a psychologist who works with transgender identifying children in the state of California, one example she gives is that a 2-year-old who rips the barrettes out of her hair is engaging in sending a gender message, right? So if you're a 2-year-old girl and you don't want to wear barrettes, you might be expressing that you think you're a boy, right? And so the whole point of this psychologist, Diana Ehrensaft, the whole point of her view of this is that atypical behavior is a gender message, okay? And so when a child engages in atypical behavior, we should socially transition them, right? In other words, we should change their gender identity marker on their birth certificate, send them to school dressed in a dress that we would associate with the opposite sex, give them toys that are typically associated with the opposite sex. But at stake here is not saying, well, this is a boy who likes pink. It's the assertion, this child likes pink, therefore this child is a girl, right? And that's the distinction. And I really need to emphasize the harm that is done by social transitioning, because it truly is a funnel into medical and surgical transitioning. And one of the things that we've seen from detransitioners is they will object that given our current cultural climate, we are boxing children into gender roles. So that girls no longer, all those freedoms that we worked so hard for in the 1970s, where girls could do what they wanted to do, those are going by the wayside. There's a graphic that one of the transgender groups in the UK put up where they had a spectrum of behavior, and according to the graphic, if you're a girl who likes to wear pants and you like to play with trucks, you might actually be a boy, rather than being a girl who likes to wear pants and play trucks. I thank God that I grew up when I did, because my entire 6th grade, I wore pants. I did not put on a dress once. I was a total tomboy. I enjoyed playing outside. I had brothers. I just wanted to be out and moving. And I think about what we're doing now, and it saddens me. So the distinction would be that a social transition is, in a sense, boxes someone in, so that we take their atypical interests and we declare them to be stereotypes, and according to those stereotypes, then we push them into a different role as a member of the opposite sex.
And if I could add one anecdote and one observation. The anecdote is that in the early 1900s, if you were at the hospital and you had a baby boy, the preferred color for boys was pink. So pink, as being associated with girls or boys, is a social construct. There's no objective truth that we learn from the Bible or from God or from reason that teaches us that pink belongs to any sex. But when groups tweet out on the internet that men who have periods are still men, or men who have babies are still men, we can say that that is objectively not true, because men don't have the medical plumbing in order to have periods and to have babies. And it's not maybe always easy to draw those types of lines, but if you think about it in terms of social constructs, things that we tend to associate with the sex but does not have an objective truth, and those that do, things that are physically true, medically, biologically, that's one place where you can start drawing lines.
Right.
So the perception of the student who's offering this question is that the student believes that there's probably few transgender students or community members here in this room. So what steps might be possible? How can we ensure that we provide a fair platform to discuss this issue in a way that includes their voices?
Yeah, that's actually a great question, because a lot of times what people will say is they will accuse you of, and I'm not saying that this is an accusation, but I think the concern is that we can't talk about to talk about this issue or to raise our concerns about this issue is to somehow deny the existence of the individuals who identify as transgender or who are suffering from gender dysphoria. And I do want to be clear that in no way, and I know I speak for John, in no way are we doing that. I think the question is, number one, this is there are two things at stake here that as I mentioned before, this is a system of beliefs that has an impact on our catechesis and that we can declare to be, either in line with or not in line with. It's a way of thinking about the human person. So number one, there's that, but then also, as I mentioned before, we live in a culture where there's a monolithic presentation that there's only one way to think about this. And so I hope that any individuals who are listening to this presentation, and I will tell you every time I speak on this issue, I inevitably at the end of the presentation, someone will come up to me afterwards who, maybe not necessarily someone who identifies as transgender, but somebody who has a family member who identifies as transgender. I hope that what we've provided is an opportunity to think that there might be another way, right? Because the way that is being pushed forward on our young people is medically harsh. It is a medically, harsh doesn't do it justice. It is a medically devastating procedure that is risky and experimental. It boxes young people into roles that they shouldn't be boxed into. And so I would hope that this is the beginning of a dialogue. What is the appropriate way to extend pastoral care to individuals? I don't know of any Catholic who would say that a person who identifies as transgender is unwelcome at our church. We welcome you, we want you, we love you, we want to support you. We'd like to support you, whatever you need for your healing. We have lines, we can engage in affirmative care, the affirmative care therapy, but we have deeply held reasons why that would not be good, and there are reasons that are supported by reason and science. But that being said, there are so many other ways that we can offer our care and support for individuals who are suffering from that. And so I would like to extend that hand of welcome and to look at this as a starting point for dialogue.
And everybody here is called to be engaged in that type of evangelization. If you know someone or know someone who knows someone that's suffering from gender dysphoria and is struggling with these issues, invite them to coffee, invite them to lunch, invite them to church. We've got to start with the loving relationship that we're all called to engage in, because if we can't get that right, then it's very difficult to have any other conversations.
Yeah, I will add too, it's hard to discuss this. It is really hard. I find myself very uncomfortable because on the one hand, we're intellectuals, we're discussing this as a series of intellectual propositions, but I'm acutely aware that there are individuals who are living this, and I know it would be hard if I were sitting in an audience listening to someone talk about the Catholic question, right? So I understand it can be, it's challenging. I hope that, I appreciate anyone who's here who does not come from our perspective. I really do. I'm so grateful for people to just come and to listen as respectfully as this audience has.
Question from a student. What does it mean, what was meant by every cell has a sex, and where is this evidence found?
Okay. That is actually one of the stipulations by the National Institute of Health when they wrote their guidelines for medical studies. That is a direct quote from those guidelines, that every cell has a sex, meaning your DNA, embedded in your DNA, is that it is either a male cell or a female cell. And for medicine, it matters. We know from our increased awareness of what we could refer to as gender med, that men and women have symptoms that are different and distinct. They react differently to different things. I was reading today, the coronavirus is more devastating to elderly men, right, rather than women. And we don't know why, but we do know that there is an associated distinction between the cells. Women experience different heart attack symptoms than men do. And there have been situations where transgender identifying individuals have presented themselves to the emergency room. There was one female to male transitioner who went to the emergency room and was actually pregnant, and for hours nobody tested. they knew that this was an individual who identified as transgender, but nobody wanted to offend that individual. So they didn't look for a pregnancy. And I think she ended up losing the baby, right? So there's a biological reality here that we can't deny. Even UPMC, Gender Clinic, is all in. And the only thing they promise to their young people, if you look at their ads, they promise the appearance of the other sex. They don't promise that you will actually be that. It's if you look at their ad, that is because there is a biological reality there that needs to be respected. And in their guidelines, young women, female to male transitioners, still have to go back for their pap smears if they haven't had a hysterectomy.
Are souls gendered? Are male souls different from female souls?
I'll leave that to the philosopher.
Well, that's actually a fantastic question. I know there are a lot of devotees of Edith Stein, and Edith Stein speculated that actually was the case, but she sort of struggled with her Thomistic philosophy. So I'm going to go instead with the explanation that's offered by a philosopher named Father Norris Clark, which is this: that a soul is not essentially gendered, right? It's not. But that your soul is unified from the moment of your conception with your body. And so your body leaves an indelible mark that is going to make you the distinctive human being who you are, and it's going to be in accord with that biological reality of your sexual identity. How's that for an explanation?
With regard to the Elliott-Larsen Act, why is it better to protect religious freedoms rather than protect against civil rights injustices against LGBT citizens?
Well, that's a fair question, and there needs to be a balance there. The reality is that right now the balance is tipping towards the LGBT community and away from protection of the religious. And when you ensconce in a law something that says any religious person who holds this particular belief is discriminatory and bigoted, even if you would create a religious exemption for them, all you're doing is letting the bigot have a get-out-of-jail-free card. In the vast majority of this country, if you had a same-sex attraction and you wanted to get married and get a cake and have flowers and all those things, you would be able to do that. But there are many places in this country where if you're a religious person and because of religious reasons you can't participate in a sacred ceremony that violates your religious beliefs, you will be sued for every penny that you have. So there is a balance that has to be struck there. It's one that's going to require a lot of dialogue. The proposals that we see tend not to reflect any balance. Let me give you a good example of that. At the federal level, the thing that's most analogous to this proposed amendment to the Elliott-Larsen Civil Rights Law is called the Equality Act. And the Equality Act would also add sexual orientation and gender identity to every anti-discrimination provision that we have in federal law. There are no exceptions in there for religions whatsoever. There's no church exemptions, there's no religious nonprofit exemptions, there's no religiously minded closely held corporation exemptions, there's no individual religious exemptions. And so when we talk about these tensions, the dozen things or so that I mentioned, then single thing on that list immediately tips towards one side of the scale. A Catholic school that only wants to have its female athletes compete against other females, not allowed to do that. The women's shelter has to allow the biological male to sleep next to the woman who's been raped. The showers are open to everybody. Employers don't have any ability to enforce sex-specific anything, whether it's dress codes or whether it's privacy spaces. It just kind of goes on and on and on. On some of these things, there may be solutions that result in both sides giving some things up. But in the things that are being proposed at the state level and the federal level right now, that's not the case at all. And people need to have dialogue about that because there are consequences that we tend not to think about.
All right. We know that there are congenital or genetic anomalies, for example, trisomy 21, that are present from the moment of conception. Why can't we affirm our embodiment while also recognizing that one's biological sex is mistaken?
That is an excellent question. The distinction that I would say is that, and I actually have a daughter who's trisomy 21, so I very much appreciate that question. The distinction that I would say is that an anomaly such as trisomy 21, or, recognizing that that anomaly exists, does not overwrite or overturn human nature, right? So my daughter with trisomy 21 I have a daughter, right? And she is thoroughly female, thoroughly human. It's not a different way of looking at her. I do think we need to be careful, because while we're focused right now on transgenderism being male to female or female to male, the growing tendency among our young people is to reject sexual identity altogether and to claim as many genders. Your gender is whatever you want to make it. So there's a video circulating from the UK group Mermaids, where a young person stands there and says, "What is your gender identity? Your gender identity is what you want it to be." And then he says, "As many people as there are in the world, that's how many genders there are." Right? And so the question about whether or not a chromosomal anomaly is analogous to an issue of gender identity, I think sort of is looking backwards, in a sense, like that's yesterday's news. The other point I want to make with respect to that question is that with these young people who are presenting or identifying as transgender, this is a situation where they are rejecting something that is the givenness of creation. So in other words, our understanding of the relationship between the body and the soul is not that the soul is some kind of essence that resides in the body and might perhaps have been mistakenly put in the wrong body. And that's what I mean by the importance of the Catholic understanding of the unity of body and soul, where you're created as this unity of body and soul from the moment of conception, and then all of the experiences you're living in living in your body is what makes you who you are, right? And so the proposition that perhaps there are people who from conception were given a different gender identity than their body rips that apart, right? It's something that we can't accept as Catholics. I don't think that, as I mentioned, I don't think that as this movement goes forward, that's not even what most people are talking about, because they're seeing gender as something that is a personal project and fluid and can in fact change, right?
And what's interesting about that is that intuitively, as humans, we all recognize this interconnection that she's been talking about. If I cut myself on a piece of paper, I didn't say my body was cut, I say I cut myself. If I get cancer, I don't say my body has cancer, I say I have cancer. Intuitively, we all understand the basic truth that our bodies and souls are inextricably interconnected, and you can't separate one from the other. Again, this whole Gnosticism heresy from the 2nd century was kind of that very notion, and it arose out of a dispute whether Jesus Christ actually ascended into heaven, body and soul. To some, that was too hard a teaching to accept. He must have gone up in his soul, but not his body. And so then there was this separation that hadn't previously existed. And the church fought mightily to resist that, and every time it rears its head, every couple of centuries, continues to do so. But I think everybody's basic experience is that there's an inextricable link there that can't be separated.
Can I also want to push back a little bit on the premise of the question, which is this: how your experience as an embodied person, male or female, is something that is distinctive and that you live from every moment, from the moment of your conception. How can you say, how do you know what it's like to actually identify as the opposite sex, other than reducing it to stereotypes and characteristics? So I remember when Bruce Jenner transitioned to Caitlyn Jenner, one of the things he started talking about, all the things that he was looking forward to doing as a woman, and it wasn't even, it was almost foreign. It was almost like a caricature, because yes, we got our nails done. That was one of the things he wanted to do. But, being a young woman and going through puberty as a young girl it's hard to describe to someone who hasn't lived through it. And I wonder, when we talk about gender identity or someone who's experiencing a gender identity, again, we're putting kids in this gender box so that they're looking and they're trying to make sense of who they are, and adolescence is all about identities. They're trying to make sense of who they are, and so if they don't fit into one box, they must fit into the other. I think we're being really unfair to our kids. I really do. I really, really do.
Question from a recent alum. If I have a sincere religious conviction against providing service to people of certain ethnicities, is this equally valid to convictions regarding gender identity? Why or why not?
Well, for starters, I don't know of any religion on the planet that would require you or even encourage you to deny service to someone based on the color of their skin or their ethnicity. And the reason for that is because that is a truly meaningless, irrelevant characteristic when it comes to services or marriage or anything else. To the contrary, the church teaches that we love everybody no matter those differences, that race, creed, slave-free, it doesn't matter, that we love the individual person. But when you're talking about something like someone's human sexuality and their gender identity, for all the reasons that we've been discussing, it does make a difference. It does matter. And the same is true of sexual orientation. And we could have an entire conversation about the church's teaching on marriage and why it is gendered, why it requires a male and a female. Dr. Farnan alluded to it, just a brief point that I love about the model of the Trinity itself, and that when you've got God the Father and God the Son who love each other so selflessly and so completely, always willing the good of the other, that love is actually a third independent person, the Holy Spirit. Just as when husband and wife come together in the marital embrace and love each other without any reservation, without anything holding back, that love actually requires a new name, and it's the name of the child that they can produce. And when we talk about being made in the image and likeness of God, that's what we're talking about, and it's inherently sexed. And that does matter. One other point on the sexual orientation issue, this is something that even the U.S. Supreme Court recognizes. In the very decision, Obergefell, where the U.S. Supreme Court created a constitutional right to same-sex marriage, which I respectfully submit doesn't actually appear anywhere in the Constitution, the 5 justices in the majority recognized that people of faith who have, even people without faith, who have a different understanding of marriage as being between one man and one woman, do so from honorable, logical belief systems. In contrast, when you're objecting to an interracial marriage, for example, there is no basis for that. It's not reasonable, it's not honorable, it's entirely born out of discrimination because of who that person is, not the conduct that they're engaging in. And so that's why these issues are so different.
Will the Catholic Church refuse to provide a funeral service for a person who identifies as transgender?
I can't imagine they would, actually. I don't speak. Each bishop is the person who makes the decisions for each of his dioceses. But this is a good question because it brings up the point that transgenderism. When we look at someone who identifies as transgender, we should never assume that that person is living in violation with chastity, right? And there may be reasons, whether it's reasons of in some cases, some of the detransitioners have talked about what was it really going on with sexual trauma, right? Where they were traumatized as young people, and so wanting to transition was safe, right? If you're a young girl who's been traumatized, sexually traumatized, being a boy seems safe to you, right? So there can be all kinds of reasons why a person might you might see transitioning as something that would provide relief from the distress that they're experiencing. But in our Catholic faith, we draw a distinction between subjective culpability and the objective nature of an action. And so that's what enables us tonight to talk about why a gender transition is not in alignment with the teachings of our faith, while still understanding that the persons who might be seeking a gender transition, there may not be any fault. This may be someone who is sincerely seeking what they have been promised will bring relief. Parents who have been told this is the only way you need to do this or your child will commit suicide, right? And so, in terms of the question of suicide, in terms of the question of sacraments, the only two, or in terms of the question of funerals, and this extends into sacraments, the only two sacraments where I think identifying as transgender is an obstacle would be marriage and holy orders, for reasons that those really have to do with you understanding your sexual identity, right? And marriage relies on the sexual difference. It's between a man and a woman, according to the teachings of the Catholic Church. And holy orders is administered only to a man, right? Other than that, whether it's being buried in the Catholic Church or the ability to go to confession, the church, we're happy when people come to the sacraments. It might require, though, that, identifying as transgender can be an objective indication that you don't really understand and agree with the church's teachings on the human person. And so that would be an opportunity for a pastor or for someone who's involved in education. A lot of times it's the bishop, to sit down with that person and say, let's talk about what the church really says about what it is to be a human being. And it can be a tremendous moment of grace. It really can.
And it brings up an important question for all of us about judging. Because in a moral relativistic culture, no one is allowed to judge the actions or beliefs of anyone else, because everyone is a law or a truth giver for themselves. And so when Pope Francis says, who am I to judge? Culture immediately jumps on that and says, well, you bad Catholics and other Christians, you shouldn't be judging someone who's making a decision to transition, for example. But what Pope Francis meant was, who am I to judge the soul of that person, the worthiness of them to get to heaven? That's why we leave questions like, funerals and sacraments to the church and don't judge people on that basis. But we are all called to judge actions and call people to holiness, because if we believe honestly that that's going to be in their best interests, if we're loving them and we want them to go to heaven, that's an essential part of being Christian. So when Jesus was confronted with the woman who committed adultery, he absolutely judged her. He saved her life and then said, go and sin no more. And so we're called to have those difficult conversations on these issues if we ultimately want to have that call to holiness be effective and get as many people to heaven as possible. But in the end, we have to leave it to God to decide who's worthy to make it into heaven. We can't judge there. All we can do is love.